everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. As many of you may have seen already, my video essay is out. The video essay I've been talking about non-stop for the last 2 months. And indeed, it did take me 2 months to do. And yeah, I hope you all have seen it. And if you have, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and comments. And yeah, I don't know. So far, the reception has been quite good. It's gotten a lot of views on YouTube. For my first video essay, it's quite... for some reason, I knew it would do well. It's definitely a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. But also, it was very obvious to me that there's this big hole that no one's talking in this, long form, historical and contemporary, using, important figures and important voices and themes and whatever. Anyway, so, again, if you have seen the video essay, would love to hear any of your thoughts. And yeah, I'm kind of excited still. Even though there obviously are a lot of trolls and Zionists in the comments. And weird people. These kind of things really elicit strange reactions from people and tend to overshare strange thoughts. And yeah, there are a couple of comments that I've been receiving that I actually want to respond to. For the most part, I don't, and I haven't been. I'm not getting Zio-baited, let's say. That sounds different than what I expected it to sound. As in baited by Zionists, not... Anyway. But that's actually not going to be the main thing of this episode. The title of this episode might sound a bit strange, or look a bit strange, and anyone with a basic understanding of arithmetics would assume that I am for hate. That's obviously not what I'm getting at. Basically, the main topic I'll talk about a bit more later on in this episode is that there is, especially in Europe, and I've seen this here in Austria, definitely seen this in Germany, I've seen this in, I haven't really been, around Europe all that much anyway, but anyway, with the ascension of the far right, and with the center moving further, just the whole thing, everything moving constantly to the right, there's so much of this discourse of against hate. And I see stickers of this, literally, Gegen Hass, and I've seen Dutch versions of it, and it strikes me as very misplaced, or it's just a bad reading of the situation in its entirety. I think it's a bit of a liberal reading, maybe. I'll get more into what I mean by that later on, but basically, it definitely is not a framework to understand A, fascism, B, structural racism, and C, where to situate ourselves. Because it all feels very good to be like, I'm against hate, I'm for love, make peace not war. But no, especially white middle-class people in the European centers, no, it's not just a matter of beliefs. It's not, I don't hate brown people, therefore I'm one of the good ones. It's no, you are within white supremacy, you are within capitalism, you are within this patriarchal imperialist system, and you have to situate yourself. You have to be honest with yourself about where you fit there. And again, I know I talk a lot about white people these days, and obviously that has a lot to do with the fact that I am in whiteness, much more so than when I'm in, let's say, the peripheries of it. This is very much I've jumped into it. I didn't want to do this. But as you can see, I've got a lot of thoughts on the matter, and so I'm going to be talking about against hate as a kind of framework that I'm seeing in the discourse, in the whatever, but also talk a bit more about, my opposition to that in terms of as a framework, in terms of a way of understanding politics and society. And but before I start today's episode, I have one brief announcement, as always, which is, if you like this podcast, if you like my voice, if you want to get to know me a bit better beyond the things that I talk about within the urgency of the current situation, I have another podcast. It's called Keep This Between Us, and it's basically a space for me to share stories, personal anecdotes, some thoughts that I don't necessarily want to share in the main feed, and the episode that I'm going to record tomorrow for that podcast will be about a very unique story that I experienced a few years ago. It's a very long story, but essentially I found myself in an apartment that was filled to the brim with books and magazines, mostly on Palestine, mostly rare editions, but they were essentially the collections of a Palestinian man who was a hoarder who passed away only like 10 years before I got into that apartment. I didn't break in. It's a long story. My point is that it's fascinating. I got to know this person through their collection. I tried to do stuff with that collection. And yeah, it was fascinating. And I still keep his picture with me at all times because, I don't know. It's a lot. Sorry, I know that doesn't sound like a very good promo, but it's a good story. And you can hear stories like that and many others. I think I have about 10, 12 episodes on that podcast at the moment. And so, yeah, if you want to hear those, it's available for Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers. So if you're not a member of our Patreon or our Apple Podcast subscription, head on over and become a member. You'll help support us. You get access to this stuff and much more. And yeah, that's the announcement. So yeah, I've got a few kind of headlines that I'll talk briefly about before I get into the bulk of this episode. The first thing I want to talk about is some of the comments that I've been getting for this video essay that I did. And again, a lot of it is in incredibly bad faith. You can tell immediately the difference between bad faith and good faith commenters on YouTube. And yeah, for the most part, I am just deleting anybody who is saying anything that comes close to Nakba denial. And otherwise, all this stuff of people calling me anti-Semitic, I knew this was going to happen. They didn't watch the video. They haven't seen anything. It's their standard thing. There is one comment that I want to address here, and definitely not there because I don't want to give them the dignity of thinking that them saying this stuff, they don't care. They're using this as a defense for genocide. So I'm not going to respond to them. But there is one thing that I find a little interesting, which is, well, actually two things. One is that there is this obsession within the Zionist discourse of, why aren't you talking about Arab colonialism? And this I find, I actually do want to talk about it, or Arab colonialism and Arab nationalism. And actually what's very funny is Edward Said, in the essay that I used extensively, does talk about Arab nationalism as a response to Zionism and European imperialism. And, he's critical, as many of us are. Arab nationalism is kind of a failed project and is something that there are certain ideas which maybe have some flavor, but as it was a failure. And anyway, so it kind of negates when they say, why didn't you talk about Arab nationalism? We do. But this thing of Arab colonialism, here it's a bit interesting, because the way they present it is essentially the Muslim conquest of the 7th century and the 8th century. And this, to them, is the colonialism that created the situation. So, that's bullshit. What I find interesting there, though, is that it's very similar to how Lebanese Phoenicianists talk. They also talk about Arab colonialism. We're not Arab. We're colonized and occupied by the Arabs. And we speak a different language. We speak Phoenician or Lebanese, which is different from Arabic. Which is just bullshit. Linguistically it's bullshit, but politically, historically. However, there is one thing that it is true is not discussed enough in Arab spaces in general. There is and has been and still exists the legacies of Arab colonialism, as in actually colonialism, as an actual whatever. And one example of this is Sudan. I find it kind of deeply troubling, and I've never actually heard a Sudanese person talk about this in this way, maybe because it's just so matter of fact that it doesn't even bear discussion. But for those that don't know, Sudan, its name comes from the Arabic word Sud, which means black. And it is literally just the land of the blacks. And I don't know how much more kind of literally racist it can be. And in this kind of way of it's the periphery of the empire, or the whatever, the region. And yeah, they definitely get a lot of racism from other Arabs. They definitely get like literally their Arabism or their Arab roots. This is definitely something that I'm not going to speak on. This is something that the Sudanese do talk a lot about, which is this like holding the mixed, conflicting sometimes identities of being African and Arab, or being Arab African, or being African. You know what I mean? But for, let's say, Levant Arabs, there's definitely so much racism against the Sudanese, just anti-black racism, and almost a denial that they have anything to do with, no, they're African, they just speak Arabic. This is fucked up. And another intense example is Western Sahara, right? Which is occupied by Morocco, which is illegally, like, prevented from any sense of self-determination. And that is literally colonialism that still exists to this day. And yeah, that obviously never gets discussed. Morocco as a state is also deeply Zionist, but that's a different thing. So that took a bit longer than I'd expected, but I do think there's a lot to discuss about Arab nationalism, its legacies, and its continued effects. I think people still do have a kind of... I mean, one of the most depressing sentences that I think haunts our region for decades is Wain al-Arab, where are the Arabs? You know, some of the chants that send chills down my spine are these ones calling out Arabs. Wain, al-Shab al-Arabi wain, you know? And yeah, you know, you see clips from Sabra Shatila, the massacre in 1982, and Palestinians, the survivors, are yelling, where are the Arabs? And where the fuck are they? And I think that's a myth of Arab nationalism that kind of just has been exposing itself constantly, that there is not an Arab unity, that the solidarity between Arab states and whatever, because these are different... Whatever, that's a whole other episode. That's not what this episode's about. I don't want this episode to be 40 minutes long. So, that's interesting. That's something I wanted to note. The other thing is, I find it astounding how deeply embedded it is in the mind of, I guess, the Israeli, or even the, like, I think specifically in the Israeli Zionist mind, is that the Palestinians are the genocidal ones. That it is, you know, whenever anybody says the sentence that every accusation is a confession, it's so true. It's so deep. And actually there's a history of this. This is the idea that, like, all colonial regimes always talk about defense. I only recently discovered that the Haganah, right, the sort of precursor of the IDF, this Jewish settlement militia that was formed in 1920, the word means the defense. And they're literally in the process of colonizing this land, and they're still talking about defense. And yeah, there's this constant thing of they want to exterminate us while exterminating them. Bizarre. It is so delusional. But I just wanted to bring that up here. So moving on to a bit more kind of worldly topics, there's a fucking invasion happening in Palestine. Not in Gaza, but in the West Bank. It is described as the largest invasion and sustained military operation in the West Bank since 2002, since the Second Intifada. And like they did then, they've invaded Jenin, and it's been 4 days. And Jenin is not only a city, but there's also a very large refugee camp in there as well. And today I was watching Mariam Barghouti, who was reporting there live, and it's a ghost town because people are fucking terrified. Because the Israelis are just there and they're just doing their wanton genocidal bullshit. It's very clear that this is the same army, this is the same command, this is the same ideology, and they are using the same practices and tactics in some ways, but also just the mentality of it in the West Bank, as they've been doing in Gaza. And I'm going to do something here, which Mariam Barghouti has been talking a lot about, which is to stop doing the separation. This is an intentional separation. You know, what's happening in West Bank, what's happening in Gaza. This is all happening in Palestine. And this is the same genocidal occupation army that is operating in both, you know, let's say, parts of Palestine. It's important to note this because the cantonization of Palestine has been a process over decades and is something that's sort of replicated even in our language sometimes. Anyway, so I don't know. That's only just coming out now, and it's kind of terrifying, and I don't know. It's just, again, really, really, really clear, and I'm constantly faced with this brutal reality of, okay, let's say everything is fully clear to everybody. Is that going to change the situation? And I have to believe that it's going to do something. But regardless, I am going to keep sharing and talking about some of these things, especially those that are slightly less, I don't know. And especially at this moment when a lot of people are tuning out. Maybe people are taking a long break. People in Palestine cannot take a break from the occupation, from the genocide, and from the settler colonial project, which is just so clearly stating its goals, which is to replace the Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, with Jewish settlers. They eventually want to just annex the place, once it does not harm their demographic, like fascistic idea of a demographic balance. Then they will just annex it, like they did with the Golan Heights. Anyway, so that's incredibly fucked and worrying, but it just does seem like the impunity that the Israeli army has been granted by the so-called international community in Gaza has really emboldened them to just do more. It's insane. It's unbelievable. Anyway, aside from that, and I don't want to keep this all too depressing, even though this podcast is called Politically Depressed, but I'm being very mindful of the fact that sometimes there can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy if I'm constantly thinking within the framework of, it's politically depressed, so I'm allowed to be you know what I mean? That I will indulge my depression a bit too much. But there have been really extensive flooding in Sudan and in Bangladesh. And these two I definitely do not see enough attention being paid to. There are a lot of fundraisers, some of which I will link in the description of this episode. And aside from that, there are just these very neglected areas. I don't know, in general, the global south, but now, especially with climate collapse, with global warming really just like bearing its face, what we knew was going to happen for decades. And so much of the destruction that's going to take place, that is taking place, is happening in these areas that are already incredibly vulnerable and, you know, kind of are just erased in the kind of worldly whatever discourse. Worldly, I don't know. I tried getting on Blue Sky for a bit. I fucking hate it. It's just a bunch of white people who still feel comfortable posting memes. Like, it's like a safe space for white people to just pretend like nothing's happening and they can just keep memeing their ways through all this stuff. And, like, doing this thing of, like, memeing my way through the apocalypse. Like, oh, don't get me started. But I basically just go there and, like, write one post where it's like, I fucking hate you all. I'm such a hater on that website, but I don't want them to feel fully safe, even though I maybe have, like, 80 followers, but no one retweets me. But yeah, Twitter is a shit show. Anyway, it's coming up to about 22 minutes at the moment, so I want to get on to the main topic of this episode, which is against hate. So, there is, and has been, for at least a decade, but now more so than ever, an accelerated increase in the normalization of fascism, of outright racism, of white supremacy. And the ways that people are responding to it, and this I mean in a kind of more established within the hegemonic circles, white people, liberals, the middle class, whatever, is in this idea of against hate. I've seen stickers I went to the Against Hate March. I've seen those banners. It's something that's very, I don't know. It is the word that's being used now. And I hate it. I think it is deeply skewed, let's say, because that's not how racism works. It's not about hate. It's not about actively feeling this like, oh, I hate them, I want bad for them. Those do exist. And let's say those like outright voting for the FPO do have these thoughts and these feelings and these antagonisms. But by and large, what we were talking about when we talk about the rise of fascism, the normalization of it, the lurch to the right in general, is much bigger than that. And I think needs a reframing of the framework within which we are understanding all this. So, firstly, the reason I said at the beginning that it's a bit liberal is because I think one of the main critiques that I have of liberals is the belief in, or rather the too heavy belief in idealism. And that's not to think as in thinking of the ideal situation, but to think that it is ideas and beliefs that move history as opposed to resources, power, military might, material conditions. I am not a Marxist. I am not one to say that it is only material conditions. I'm also not dogmatic, so I'm not saying it's either this or that. I do think there's a blend of both. But thinking about racism and thinking about why it is rising, and from those who are already experiencing economic and political and social and racial violence, they're not talking about, stop hate. Like, this is a separate discourse. So, what I'm going to talk about is how structural racism functions, regardless of how individual members, even those that are like within the hegemonic identities under these structures, the protected identities for now, let's say, regardless of their feelings and beliefs. Y'all could have the best intentions, but you could still be doing tremendous amounts of harm and supporting and being complacent within a structure and a system that does incredible amounts of harm. And I'm going to be using two main examples, which are borders and visas. These are obviously very related, but these are two things that I've noticed that for sure Europeans, I mean specifically white Europeans in Europe, do not understand, do not see even. And so they can be the most loving whatever person in their heart, but every single day be completely unaware of the tremendous amounts of violence that is kind of in the system that they live in, that they benefit from, that by not resisting against it themselves are complacent and complicit within. So borders are a really important place to be thinking about the structures that are acceptable. I think it was, who is this? Whatever, I don't care. Some big Russian writer who said, if you want to measure the degree of civilization of a society, step into one of its prisons. And borders oftentimes do function a lot like prisons. It's very regulated. There's a lot of investment by the state and a lot of surveillance by the state who's coming in and out. And it's not just a transactionary thing. Borders follow you because it's all about papers. But anyway, before all of that, very concretely, materially, Europe has made the Mediterranean one of the world's largest graveyards. There are countless bodies of men, women, and children fleeing insecurity, instability, war, famine in their own countries towards Europe. a lot of these systems, a lot of these collapses, a lot of the reasons they're fleeing and the reason that their countries are unstable and fucked and whatever have so much to do with colonialism and neocolonialism. Like, this is something that is so, hard to hold together, but people are fleeing violence that stems from European extractivism, whatever, and neocolonial violence and imperialism. I mean, a lot of these countries are literally in debt to the IMF. And who are these debtors but European countries? A lot of these countries, let's say in Africa, are completely deprived. They are not poor countries. They're incredibly rich countries, but they're like intentionally, what's the term that people use? It's not underdeveloped. It's like, I don't know, plundered. And all of it was taken into Europe. And so now, increasingly, especially more and more with climate collapse, the only places of safety are those places where all the gold was taken to, where all the wealth, where all the resources. And again, this is not 100 years ago. This is still to this very day. The IMF functions very much as a neocolonial institution that, whatever, God. This is going to actually be another video essay. But the point is that you literally have coast guards, Frontex coast guards, that are pushing back boats, or Greek coast guards as well, that are intentionally drowning boats. This actually did happen. Hundreds have been intentionally killed. And this is all just by sea. This isn't anything to do with the Balkan routes or whatever. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, this sort of use of refugees as kind of, pawns by, I think, Belarus. And it was like, the fact that they can be used, or the way Turkey has kind of leveraged or blackmailed essentially Europe by the fact that they have these refugees, so many Syrian refugees, and that they are preventing them and doing the violence of whatever. God, actually, there's so much to this. But yeah, the European borders are bloodstained, and every single day they continue to become more and more dangerous places. And this is Europe, right? Even though they're paying, even regimes like in Lebanon, in Sisi's Egypt, in Tunisia, Libya, like there are all these border countries, essentially, that are being given billions of euros to be this sort of offshore border for Europe, because they don't want their literal soil to be bloodstained, even though it's been bloodstained for centuries. But so this is precisely where it's this type of situation, this type of context, where fascism really becomes normalized, where treating human beings as things, as objects, as numbers, and literally unwanted numbers, and the pushing of them out. And with that, the discourse. I remember so much the discourse of 2015, and literally the disgusting racism and xenophobia and white supremacy. Again, I emphasize white supremacy, as bell hooks used to do, because it helps situate all of us within it. Like, we don't all live within racism. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But we all do, or at least specifically in Europe and its peripheries and whatever, within white supremacy, right? Within white supremacist capitalism. And yeah, because that's what it's all about. Racism kind of sounds like a belief. White supremacy, you can imagine, these are white supremacist borders, because they are keeping black and brown people out and protecting the white center. You see what I mean? And so these are things that white Europeans just don't think about. They literally just don't see it. In many ways, part of the project of Europe and Fortress Europe and the EU is very much like pushing those things out there. Like, Austria doesn't really have its own borders because it's surrounded by EU states. But yeah, when I take a train now to Germany or to whatever, there are police that come and check. Like, they've checked me several times, but they definitely check every single black and brown person there, because they're like, it's an open border, but you look like you're up to some shit. And so that kind of regulation, that kind of surveillance, that kind of intimidation, even within, it's so felt by like all the immigrants I ever talked to. This is like the main conversation that I have with people from, my region. And so, yeah, there's tremendous amounts of violence involved with borders. And another way that violence exists is in the prevention of having people even come here to begin with. And this has so much to do with visas. Visas is another thing that, again, it just feels so bureaucratic. It feels so objective and benign. And what does that have to do with white supremacy? Or fascism? But really, this sort of visa regime, is actually not that old. I mean, international travel itself is not amazingly old, or like the ease for regular people to move around. But passports and visas, and honestly, for me, so much struggle that a lot of the people I know that have in even just coming here, and is because of visas, is because visas are expensive. I have had several white people here in Europe be shocked by this fact. You have to pay for a visa? Yes. And having to pay for something makes it less accessible for those that can't pay. And it's not just paying the €100 or whatever that it costs to do the whatever. It's all the papers that you have to get. And it's proving that you have a certain amount in your bank account. This can be up to about €10,000. And again, fewer and fewer people are able to travel. And where is the logic here? Well, because if we allow just anybody to come, then we'll be flooded, because everyone wants to come and live in Europe. No, girl. No. People don't. People want to live in their fucking homes. They want to live, it's honestly difficult for them to understand that people actually have a sense of land, of their home. And not everyone is just so willing to get up and go wherever. And if it's about, what does this have to do with us? Get your fucking boots off our necks. Get out of Africa. Stop funding the Zionist fucking regime that's destroying the entire region, contributing so much to the fucking insecurity. It's this cycle, and it is so connected. When Europe funds dictators, and these dictators literally plunder the country and create this insecurity, and then people are fleeing, and then Europe closes its borders and is well, we don't want any of these people. It's well, you shouldn't have fucking made... Jesus. I know this is all very macro, and I usually don't like talking about it in this way, but there is so much about the flows of migration northwards with the global capitalism that is so projected downwards, as in there's so much wealth that's extracted constantly, and this wealth is extracted by kind of proxy regimes, and with the IMF, who become wealthy off the backs of IMF loans, but then the country gets fucking depleted, and then in general neoliberalism is fucked. I fucking hate it. I really hope I made a point in all this. This is definitely a very big ramble. But so, yeah, this identity, this idea of protecting us, protecting what we have, once examined, and this is what borders do. This is what visas do. There is this imaginary of we can't let them come here because they will replace us, And that is the great replacement theory. And what's really funny is if you push just a bit further with any single person here, they will replicate that, and they don't know it. Well, we can't let everybody just come here. Why not? Well, because then it'll cease to be Austria. We just don't have the funds. And then they become kind of capitalist. You can talk to an anti-capitalist, but then will not connect the fact that maintaining this, within capitalism, maintaining their kind of hegemony, their kind of security within it, requires white supremacy. If you want to say, no, we want to keep this country for ourselves, well, okay, that's kind of sounding like, So anyway, I think Against Hate is a horrible framework. It is a feel-good framework for white people to be like, oh, because again, you can just think that you love black people, listen to black music, you got one or two black friends, but you don't think at all about borders. You don't think at all about the visa regime. You don't have to hate Congolese people to be buying vapes. You don't have to hate Palestinians to be eating at McDonald's. You can literally just think that they don't exist, or rather not even know that they exist, not even know that McDonald's is literally catering this fucking genocide, and that Palestinians have been saying for many, many, many months, don't eat fucking McDonald's. And so here we return to the idea of erasure, which is something I brought up a lot in my video essay, wherein it's sometimes not things that you know but you think you have a good opinion on. It's oftentimes things that you don't even know. And especially when you're like deep within a certain system of domination or structure of domination, there's just stuff that literally it doesn't even occur to you. It feels so peripheral, but actually once you center it for a second, the center ceases to hold in a kind of interesting way. So yeah, Against Hate. I think this is a fun title, and yeah. I don't know, I think ContraPoints did a funny bit a few years ago, calling it like the Westboro Baptist Church version of bigotry. Like this idea that people go around and it's like, God hates fags, and it's like, that isn't how structural homophobia and transphobia works. Access to healthcare, access to housing, access to fucking just basic resources for survival. Also, huge thing, like houseless communities. Jesus, the amount of fascism that's essentially practiced on them that then, I don't know, gets kind of normalized and spread. And whereas this is all a massive distraction from actually drawing connections between white supremacy and capitalism. And this is the real thing, because the average white person here has so much more in common with a climate refugee, even from such a faraway country like Libya, or from Nigeria, God forbid, than they do with a fucking billionaire. But honestly, because they're white. Honestly, because and again, whiteness is not just a skin tone thing. There's behaviors, there's language, there's sort of common sensibilities. Whatever. I honestly still naively dream of a day wherein these things don't need to be said with such fervor. But honestly, I find myself thinking this, having conversations here and there, but knowing very well that this is not a popular conception of whatever. But yeah, so that's my whole thing on this shitty liberal discourse that ultimately ignores what the actual victims and people who are actually facing racism, fascism, patriarchal violence, the like, are talking about. And girl, it's not hate. I mean, there are cases of specifically like assault where it's like there's an obsession and this person hates us. But for the most part, it's structural. And structures are harder to identify, harder to understand, but they exist and they're fucking killing us. And yeah, like I say all the time, we need to dismantle them or we're all fucked. And so on that lovely, bright note, that is another episode of Politically Depressed. I do apologize for the length of this, although I hope you actually enjoy and appreciate the longer form. I did not expect it. But as always, thank you for listening. If you want to support this podcast, please become a member of our Patreon or Apple Podcast subscription, or send me a tip in the tip jar below. If you can't support financially, leave me a review. Takes 5 seconds. Not a review, sorry, a rating. It's just like, give me 5 stars. Make sure it's 5, so I know I did a really good job. Anyway, And other than that, tell your friends and family. And yeah, that's it from me for this week. I'll see you all next time.